Manhattan. Oscar Starlett retires, age 22. John O'Neill picked up the discarded paper from the top of the garbage can. He wanted to read that the starlet was as washed up as he was. He scanned the first few lines of the story. Tal Shaw, Oscar winner just a few weeks ago, stunned Hollywood yesterday by announcing that she will never act again. She has refused to explain her decision. Gossip says she has joined a cult called Golden Angelica based in New York. O'Neill was about to throw the paper back in the garbage when the last paragraph caught his eye. Jim Kelly, retiring police chief for the Bronx, has praised the cult, it said. Kelly claimed the cult has discovered a miracle pill. He has called for the drug to be distributed nationwide. There's been no official reaction to his comments. O'Neill was intrigued. But it was just a story in a newspaper, wasn't it? The daily serving of mind corrosion, he grunted. The only miracle pill he was interested in right now was one that would make all the assholes in his life disappear. That would be the miracle of miracles. He thrust the paper deep into the garbage can and hurried away. He headed towards Chinatown, trying not to think about what his boss had said a couple of hours earlier. That man was a walking asshole, a fucking headache with a mouth. Why did these people exist? Did they get off on making other people's lives a misery? He looked down at the sidewalk. It was wet after hours of rainfall. He wanted to weep. His career, if it could be called that, was so far gone he'd need a Ouija board to get back in touch with it. Rain slapped against his face. This cold April weather was no good for his mood, already below periscope depth and sinking fast. He imagined a thick-bearded U-boat commander screaming, "Dive, dive, dive." But where the hell do you go when you're already at the bottom? He walked faster. Sometimes you just need to be moving, he thought. If you stop, you'll fall over and never get up again. He walked past a Chinese takeaway shop. The smell was revolting. Just as he put his hand over his nose, someone collided with him. A small figure went reeling backwards with a high-pitched squeal. O'Neill looked down and saw a middle-aged woman sprawled on her back, the contents of a bag of groceries scattered around her. She must have just left the little corner store. He was 6'1" and 200 pounds. The woman was small and spindly, with bad hair and amateur-hour makeup. "You stupid man," she screeched. She instantly whipped herself into a fury. "People like you shouldn't be allowed out. People like him? Fuck you," he snarled and scuttled away, the apology he was formulating abruptly canceled. In his mind, he pictured himself as an insect, like a creature from the bug planet in that dumb old movie Starship Troopers. He felt stupid and clumsy. He knew he should go home and try to calm down, but he was too fired up to do anything sensible. He wanted to go somewhere where everyone was worse off than he was. He turned up his collar against the rain and headed for the Mexican bar at the intersection of Kenmare Street and Bowery. He needed a half bottle of Metaxa. It knocked him out faster than anything else. It helped him forget, and there was so much of that to do. Mostly he wanted to forget his boss. "I want this and I want that, and don't give me any of your attitude, and I'm watching you, and your performance review is due next month, isn't it?" Yeah, give it a rest, prick. You can only take so much, can't you?" He had dreamt for months of saying no to this jerk. He would have given anything. But you have to buy no, and it cost more than he could ever afford. So like everyone else, he had to keep his mouth shut. He couldn't go on like this. When something has to give, it always does. As O'Neill crossed the road, he saw a convoy of about 30 young people on golden scooters. Students, he guessed. They were heading in his direction, tooting their horns. He gave them a double take. They were all dressed in gold. There were several pretty women in the group, with golden braids in their hair and gold dust on their faces. They looked terrific, kind of like angels. The group stopped at traffic lights just in front of him. "The big hats are interested," he heard one of them saying. "Uniforms behind us," another said. He wondered what they were talking about. He turned round and noticed that a black limousine was cruising behind the scooters. The college kids looked at the car. One of them said something and they all began to laugh. That was all he needed, the happy gang. He was getting the shakes. He needed a drink badly. Forget the half bottle. This was time for a full blowout. A few more steps and he reached Bar Hacienda. He pushed open the familiar swing doors, painted in black lacquer that had been flaking for as long as he had been coming here. That seemed like forever. But it was just 6 months since he had moved into this part of downtown Manhattan. He lived in a cheap studio flat in a rundown corner of Little Italy. The bar was full of the usual collection of deadbeats and lowlifes, the triple L's as he called them, the lost, the lonely, and the loveless. Men with hollow faces, sleepless eyes, and black leather jackets. In this joint, they felt secure enough to put away the tough faces they wore on the street. Now they just stared with numb eyes at bottles of tequila. A scratched copy of La Bamba was playing on an old jukebox. A woman in her late 30s with greasy blonde hair and a dirty red dress was dancing badly on the tiny dance floor. No one looked at her. No one talked. Cigarette stubs covered the floor. O'Neill went to the bar and waited for Luis, the regular barman, to serve him. Luis had a face that was so hangdog it seemed to be dripping onto the bar. He always took his time, as if he had to pay the IRS for every movement he made. At last he looked up from the baseball magazine he was flicking through. "Mr. O'Neill," he said with his lay-it-on-thick Mexican accent. "What can I get you?" O'Neill frowned. "Metaxa, Luis, the whole deal." Luis nodded. He put his hand beneath the bar and pulled out a bottle of Metaxa brandy. It was a cheap and nasty Greek drink. Liquor, really, rather than brandy. But it was O'Neill's favorite. He took the bottle and slid over to the table in the corner. It was the darkest, most anonymous part of the room. No one ever bothered him there. He felt like the invisible man, and that was just the way he liked it. The walls around the booth were covered with tattered pictures of mariachi players. They seemed as washed up as he was. O'Neill placed his Metaxa on the table and poured his first drink of the night. He wanted the brandy to wipe clean every thought he had of the bums who were on his case every day, never letting up, barking and whelping at him like dogs, especially that fuckrat of a boss. Got to escape somehow. He slammed back the brandy. He winced. It was dreadful, utterly gross, perfect. The doors swung open and a blast of cold, wet air rushed in. In they came, skinny, tall, beautiful. They were androgynous men and women like models from a Calvin Klein advert. All dressed in gold. They were the same kids he had seen outside on the scooters. There were 7 of them. The others were probably waiting outside or had gone to different bars. He had hated them the moment he saw with them with all that excess of youthful enthusiasm. They were still laughing, having a great crack. They had stolen his share of the pleasure, hadn't they? There's only so much of it to go around, you see. It's strictly rationed. These kids wanted to keep it all to themselves. They had the faces of worshipers. Worshipping life, worshipping themselves, worshipping every goddamn thing. What did they know of a dreary life like his where dreams had long since stopped showing up? One of them pushed his way to the front of the group. O'Neill was amazed by the man's appearance. He had long blonde hair and eyes that were too blue. He was a dead ringer for the classic image of Jesus Christ. He walked towards the bar. But the closer he got, the slower he moved, until it seemed like he was trapped in glue. O'Neill was amazed. All of the man's companions were now walking in the same crazy way. Was this some kind of wind-up? Performance artists. Had to be. They were always pulling stunts like this. There was probably a guy with a concealed camcorder filming the whole thing. Who the fuck were these people? They were getting on his case now. These people didn't belong. Not their gig. An out-of-town experienced tourists in his wilderness. His mood was going downhill fast, and it had been in a bottomless hole to begin with. He looked around. All the regulars were staring at the college kids. They didn't like strangers, not one bit. He could smell trouble. An old sailor with puffy eyes was stabbing a silver-handled knife into an old piece of wood. O'Neill took another sip of Metaxa and waited for something to kick off. The leader of the college kids ordered a bottle of tequila and 7 glasses. Luis served him without a word. The kids found themselves a table and sat down. It was weird. No more clowning around. They had become quiet and sluggish, just like the regulars. They seemed as depressed as everyone else. O'Neill began to get spooked. He couldn't work out what was happening. Either these kids were taking the rip out of everyone in the bar, a real stupid thing to do since many of the regulars were packing and on the shortest of fuses, or it was almost as if they had absorbed the feelings of the regulars. The regulars stopped staring at them. So did he. His thoughts returned to his boss. "I want you to come in at the weekend," the sleazebag had grunted. "That was just 2 hours ago. It's not overtime. It's a freebie from you to us to show your commitment, right?" He had no choice. He couldn't go on like this. Had to get out. But who else would employ him? Who would hire a guy with a PhD in biopsychology from Harvard who had turned his back on science? A guy who had bummed around in one dead-end job after another. Fact was, he was a failure. He hated his job, hated his life. He did nothing and nothing ever happened to him. He was a nowhere man going backwards slowly. For someone who had been given every privilege on offer in life, courtesy of being the son of a much-loved senator, he couldn't have sunk lower. The doors of the bar opened again. 2 men dressed in black uniforms and black berets with no identifying insignia came in. They looked like some kind of police or military. The regulars weren't intending to find out what they wanted. One after another, they put down their drinks and left. Soon, O'Neill was left alone with the uniforms, the college kids, and Luis. He thought of leaving too, but he was curious. What were the uniforms going to do? They went over to the kids and stood next to their table. The students glanced at them. Like the others, they stood up and left. Luis picked up his baseball magazine again. O'Neill poured another Metaxa to settle his nerves. The two uniforms now turned their attention to him. They sat down opposite him. "Mr. O'Neill?" one of them asked. The man who spoke had the face of the sort of man who believed in God and family, good and evil, America über alles, and all that shit. O'Neill was horrified. How did these men know his name? How had they found him here? "Who the hell are you?" he snapped. "How do you know who I am?" "We know all about you, Mr. O'Neill. We've been fully briefed." They made no attempt to hide their revulsion for him as they took in his bedraggled appearance and his shaking hand desperately clutching the neck of the Metaxa bottle. "Briefed? What are you talking about?" He could hear a shriek in his voice. He felt trapped. No way out of the exitless maze. "Someone wants to see you regarding a matter of great importance. Look, you have the wrong man. There's been some kind of mistake. I work in a factory that makes refrigerators. I don't know anything important." "We know all that. It makes no difference. The person who wants to meet you is waiting outside in a limousine." "I don't know anyone who drives around in a limo." "This person knows you." O'Neill was becoming agitated. His shakes were worse than ever. He reached for his Metaxa and poured himself an extra-large shot. "Yeah, who is it?" His mouth felt dry. His heart was pumping overtime. "Your father, Senator O'Neill. He thinks you can do a priceless favor for the Catholic Church."